Thank you very much, Tomohiro-san, for that kind words of introduction. And also I want to thank RIETI for allowing me to launch my book on this very important platform. I've seen the list of participants and I'm truly humbled to see how many people are listening. This is a book that I wrote in a hurry. It was based on about 24 articles I had published on LinkedIn over the last 6 months analyzing Trump's trade policy. But I put it together quickly because I think this is a time of historical importance to the world trading system. And I also believe that there is a lack of understanding as to what's actually going on and how dangerous it is and what people should do to react. So I rushed this book out to get during the time between the April 9th suspension of the tariffs and the July 9th potential reimposition to make a comment on the events that are going. But let me start by saying that most of what I'll be talking about today is things that will happen in the future. And the future, of course, is something that none of us can know. But when it's a future that it's this important, the way to deal with it is to have conversations with lots of people who know what they're talking about in different domains. And that's the second purpose of my book, is to provoke conversations. I say some things that may be somewhat controversial. Think, though, that this is to provoke a conversation. And at the end of that conversation, we won't all have the same view of what's going to happen, but hopefully the exchange of insights will make us more confident or more prepared for our own view of where the future's going. So with that introduction, let me just get started on the slides. As you can see, the title is The Great Trade Hack, Why Trump's Trade War Fails and the World Moves On. That's basically the message of the book. It's sad that 110 pages can be summarized in one title, but that's basically it. So here's what I'm going to be talking about today. Let me see if I can, there we go. So this is the outline. I'm going to do the introduction, why the Great Trade Hack is historic and why I called it the trade hack rather than trade war. Then I'm going to talk about how we should think about Trump's motives. And I think this part, which is somewhat controversial, is super important in thinking about how countries and companies should react to what's going on. The third point is I'm going to explain, in my view, why Trump's trade war will fail economically inside the United States, but why it wins politically inside the United States. And as part of that, I'm going to argue that the American stepping down from trade leadership is permanent, or as permanent as things get, to try and make the point that we shouldn't try and wait for 3 years and everything will go back. I think the US has permanently changed its political economy equilibrium to be anti-globalization. And I don't think that's going to change even when President Trump leaves office. The next point will be to look at 4 scenarios of how the world might evolve and to discuss some political economy forces which guide my thinking about which of these is going to happen. And then lastly, how can leaders avoid the worst outcomes? So let me just jump into that. The first point, Trump's great trade hack is historic. It's the beginning of the post-US trade leadership era. I would say, remember what you were doing on April 2nd or April 3rd if you were in Asia. I was actually in Tokyo when it happened. That's something your grandchildren will read about in history books as the moment when America stopped being the leader of the world trading system. So this is why I call it the Great Trade Hack. What was Trump trying to do? Was he trying to reform the trade system? Was he trying to suppress China? Was he trying to renegotiate foreign tariffs? The answer for me is no. He was hacking the system. He was bypassing the code, short-circuiting the rules, and brute forcing a quick fix using tariffs that were big, bold, and everywhere at once. This was not a US trade war. This was a US war on the trade system. So that's why I chose the word hack rather than trade war, because I think what happened on April 2nd was distinctly different than everything that had come before. Let me make that argument. Why April 2nd tariffs were different. Before, Trump's tariffs were for specific problems with specific partners. And I'm talking about, for example, President Trump during his first term, or President Trump's tariffs before April 2nd. It was on steel or autos or semiconductors, or it was with China or maybe Canada. These were bad, but not historic. Many nations have done similar things. The April 2nd hack was different. It massively and intentionally broke every trade promise the US had made with anybody, anywhere. All the WTO commitments that the US had made since 1947 were broken on purpose. All the free trade agreements that the United States had ever signed with anybody were broken. That's what happens when you unilaterally put tariffs up against people you've promised to leave them down. Second, it intentionally and completely violated Article 1 of the WTO's rulebook, which is MFN, or non-discrimination. And that wasn't a side effect. That was done on purpose for reasons I'm going to explain in a second. So that's why I think this is a US war on the trade system, not a US war, trade war. So in my view, this is a start of the post-American trade leadership era. Before April 2nd, the US was universally regarded as the steward of the system. The US set up, guided, and defended the rules-based trade system since 1947. And they did this for enlightened self-interest. The US found economic, political, and geostrategic power enhanced by their support of the trading system. If you remember, first it was the Cold War, in which US leadership of the trading system was useful in the competition against the Soviet Union, and in the war on terror, and in the war on drugs. And generally speaking, America's power was based because they were looking after the trade system, and the trade system was helping everybody. After April 2nd, the US is universally regarded with suspicion. On April 2nd, the US broke with the world trading system without suggesting reforms or any alternative system. It just walked away. It broke all the rules, did not suggest any other rules, and then just pretended that the rules don't exist. So what most viewed as fundamentally a US-China conflict before April 2nd is now viewed as US against the world. I think many, many countries around the world, when they saw what was going on in Trump's first administration and Trump's second administration up to April 2nd, was fundamentally China had increased its power and its manufacturing footprint worldwide. The US felt threatened by that, and there was a trade war going on between these two countries. So before this time, it wasn't terribly unlike the conflict between the US and Japan in the 1980s and early 1990s. It was essentially particular problems on particular subjects with a particular country. After April 2nd, it was the US against the world. And China, Russia, and the emerging economies gained politically from the US status erosion due to the worldwide suspicion that's the US with which the US is now held. When people are negotiating trade deals with the US, no, they're not sure what's going to happen. The US and the UK did a deal not too long ago, which involved reduced tariffs on steel exports from the UK to the US. Then the US increased the tariff from 25% to 50% without warning. And it's not clear whether that is affecting the trade agreement that the US did with the UK. So we're in a situation where nobody really knows what the US is going to do. So this is one way to sort of put it very starkly. From 1947 to 2005 was the American leadership era of enlightened self-interest. And remember that this wasn't charity on the side of the United States. It was good for the United States, and it was good for the rest of the world. And I think that's why most people thought that the US would continue being a leader. Of course, protectionist pressures here and there, every country has these, but would remain as a leader because it was in the interest of the United States. Then President Trump did the great trade hack. And afterwards, we're in the post-American leadership era, where the US has abandoned the world trading system. Okay, the second point. the framework for thinking about President Trump's motives. Now, this is the most controversial part of the book, and I think the most important in the sense that I believe the insights I'm going to talk about will help people think through what is going on with Trump and how he imposes them, how he negotiates them, how he takes them off. I think that's clear. So the key paradox is Trump's tariffs are trade policy, but they're economically incoherent. So thinking about them as trade policy doesn't work. So I've developed this idea that he's driven by the grievance doctrine, which I'll explain in a second. But let me, before I move into the argument, say many people, many economists, spend almost every day saying, I can't believe Trump did that. For instance, raise the tariffs on steel from 25% to 50%, thereby undermining the competitiveness of any US-based manufacturer who uses steel. Why did they do that? And day after day, people are going, it's crazy. Why is he doing that? Won't work. Now, I think we as economists ought to move beyond that and realize that he is not pursuing economic goals. He's pursuing grievance. And there is a logic behind what he's doing. It just has nothing to do with economic goals. So that's the argument I'm going to make. So this is the grievance doctrine. The 2 April tariffs were not based on economic goals. This is my assertion. Grievance guides his policy. His policies and reversals are designed to address Trump's sense of national victimhood and assuage grievances of his political base. So the question is, where does this sense of victimhood come from? The answer is a mythic tale where a naive America played by the rules and got played by globalists abroad and traitorous globalists at home. America was humiliated, factory jobs were stolen, and the middle class paid the price. This myth creates a mandate to strike back, to erase the humiliation, but it comes with no specific economic goals. So what I want to say here is, and this is why I think it's hard, this is controversial, is anybody who sits outside the United States can't believe that the US feels it's the victim of the trading system. I think most people around the world think the US has run the trade system for the interest of US multinationals and US in general. Of course, it's helped lots of people at the same time, but many people around the world, especially in the emerging market, feel they were the victims of the trade system because of what America did, or America with G7 allies. So when Trump starts saying that it was America who's a victim, I think it's hard for many people to understand where that's coming from. And that's what I want to do in the next couple of slides, is elucidate where his thinking is coming from. So the grievance doctrine guides Trump's trade policy. The grievance doctrine isn't a strategy, it's a story, it's a myth. But the grievance doctrine unlocks the internal logic of Trump's April 2nd tariffs, what drives it, how it unfolds, and where it leads. And I will assert that you cannot make sense of Trump's actions without grasping how grievance drives them. A lot of things he does look erratic or chaotic, but once you understand that it's being driven by grievance and a sense of victimhood, it all makes much more sense. So let me just give, I'm going to not skip this as I did before. This is evidence for the grievance doctrine. So it sounds crazy, but this is in the president's 2025 trade policy agenda, which is a bureaucratic report published every year by the US Trade Representative, the USTR. Now, normally it's just filled with very boring, legalistic discussion of trade and trade policy and the goals. This year, it contains the grievance doctrine in the introduction. So this is the first sentence of this normally bureaucratic thing. The United States of America is the most extraordinary nation the world has ever known. In the previous century, it saved the entire world. That's the first sentence. And then it talks about the fall. This is like a Greek myth. Today, the upward mobility offered by manufacturing sector is not widely available to the working class. Much of our industrial might has moved overseas. And then it identifies the villains. These trends are the product of a withering decades-long assault by globalist elites who have pursued policies, including trade policies, with the aim of enriching themselves at the expense of the working people of the United States. As a result, the middle class has atrophied. Now there it is. That's in an official document. He's explaining that America has been a victim of globalist abroad and globalist at home. So then it identifies the hero. President Trump alone recognized the role of trade policy has played in creating these challenges and how trade policy can fix them. So you see, they're saying every other president in the United States missed this, or at least they were participating in it. Only President Trump has recognized that the US is actually a victim. So here you have to see this is very personalized with him. And the retribution, the trade challenges facing our country will be annihilated. That's not normal trade diplomatic words. Annihilated is not what you usually say. And from this moment on, America's decline is over. Now, if you listen to Trump's words in the speech where he announces April 2nd, it's much stronger. He's using words that sound like he's talking about war crimes, not trade policy. So this is a quote from his speech. For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friends and foe alike. American steelworkers, auto workers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen watched in anguish as foreign leaders have stolen our jobs, foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories, and foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful American dream. In 2016, I declared, I'm your voice. Today I add, I am your warrior. I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. Now, those are words that are uncomfortable for trade policy people to look at because it's so out of line. But this is actually, in my mind, what's driving what he's doing and guides it forward. And once you start thinking about this, not as a sales pitch, but as a motivation, his actions make a lot more sense and it'll help guide the reaction. Okay, so this sounds strange, but give it a try. The April 2nd tariffs make perfect sense from the grievance doctrine. It's designed to stop the steal by closing the deficits. It's designed to maximize US bilateral leverage by removing non-discrimination and having a separate deal with each country. And it makes the flip-flops that we've seen make sense. His base sees him as strong in outraging foreigners and domestic elites with his April 2nd tariffs and bold increases, for instance, 145% for China for a while, 50% threatened against the EU. And then he's wise in showing flexibility while forcing foreigners to submit to his will. So what looks like a crazy thing going up and down like that looks like strength and wisdom to his base. And you can also see why tariffs are beautiful. One of the strangest things the president has ever said is that tariffs are the most beautiful words in the dictionary. I think I would have started with motherhood, but anyways, tariffs is tariffs. But here it makes perfect sense because the tariffs stop the steal by eliminating the deficit in his mind. It ends the humiliation by reindustrializing America in his mind. It helps the middle class by protecting jobs in his mind, and it extracts reparations like war reparations as billions are paid into the US Treasury by foreigners. And he says trade wars are good and easy to win. So without clear goals, the outrageous policy announcements and constant changes are a success. That is the success. The deals with foreigners just need to look like a victory. So he's not actually trying to redress the trade balance. He's not actually trying to reindustrialize America. He's not actually trying to protect the middle class. It would be nice if that happens. It's looking like he's standing up and countering the victimhood. That's my view of it. Okay, so let's use the grievance doctrine to organize the thinking about the April to May timeline. This is what I'm going to argue. So April 2nd trade hack, this is what all of us remember. April 2nd, Trump's great trade hack was announced. And on April 2nd, he said the tariffs would go into effect on April 9th. The stock market plunged, the bond yield spiked. That's usually work in opposite direction, but it did that time. Between the 3rd and the 9th of April, the US and China escalated their tariffs to over 100%, which was business destroying levels. Market turmoil intensified. In particular, the US bond market for treasuries looked like it was about to melt down. So on April 9th, 1 minute past midnight on Washington time, the US imposed the tariffs. By lunchtime, Trump had backed down, but not on China. So they were all up to wherever they were. They went back down to 10% except for China, where they stayed high. The stocks surged, but the bond yields continued to climb. On May 4th, what that did, that April 9th and the 145% on China, was essentially stop shipment of industrial products from China to the United States. Now, since it takes about 1 month for the ships to go between China and Los Angeles, it wasn't until early May that the shortages started showing up. So American factories had to slow down production, lay off workers, and sometimes shut down because they weren't getting the inputs that they needed from China. And it's worthwhile remembering that China had become an essential supplier of industrial goods to the United States, in fact, the whole world. So by early May, President Trump was actually desperate to reverse his tariffs on China, but he couldn't remove the tariffs unilaterally because this wasn't about policy. You see, when China put retaliation against what US did on April 9th, that was outrageous. It's as if somebody was a thief and then asked that you pay back to them. So that was the outrage that led to it. And also, because it was outrage rather than policy, he couldn't remove them unilaterally. He needed China to remove theirs in order to stay with the grievance doctrine that we were just going down together. So China refused to negotiate with the US until the US said that they had made a mistake. And on May 8th, Trump said, we can lower the tariffs to 80% or something like that. China took that as a face save, and then they made the deal. And in 1 weekend, they went down. Now let's look at what the deal they actually did. The US-China deal on 12th May 2025, the US and China went up 125 percentage points each between the 2nd and the 9th of April. And on May 12th, both went down 115 percentage points. So now there's 10% each way, plus whatever existing tariffs there was. So the US had the 20% on fentanyl for China, and China had retaliated against those tariffs already. So it went up, and you see what happened there was this undermined the whole logic of the April 2nd tariff formula. The April 2nd tariff formula was based on bilateral trade imbalances. And China has the largest bilateral trade balance with the United States. But by going down to the 10%, removing all of the extra add-on that comes from the deficit, Trump undermined the logic of those, which was supposed to rebalance the trade deficit. And also, Trump allowed China to maintain the 10% retaliatory tariffs, which he said weren't allowed because US was the victim. And so what happened there was due to lack of thinking through what was happening. But when he was doing it, when he was angrily raising tariffs against China, he was expressing a grievance and being guided by grievance, not thinking ahead about any economic consequences. Okay, so I'm going to skip this part. Why did China win so big? We'll see what happens now. But the only thing I will say is that the last point here on the bottom of the page, China let the US portray this as a big win for America. So in the press releases, it was 30% for America, 10% for China. But of course, what happened was the April 2nd tariffs were completely reversed, the add-on for China. But China allowed the US to claim victory. And this is very important because the US policy is driven by grievance, not by goals. Allowing Trump to say he's won is a key part to any deal you do with Trump. It doesn't matter the outcome. What matters is what it looks like. Happy headlines is what's needed. Okay, so I'm going to skip this stuff. So now the third point, and I'm running I have to go a little bit faster. Why Trump's tariff fail economically but win politically inside the United States. And here I'm going to try and make the point that American protectionism is permanent. So tariffs fail economically. First of all, tariffs cannot fix the trade deficit. This is something that's well known to international economists because deficits are the difference between economy-wide spending and economy-wide production. Americans are spending more than they're producing, and the balance has to come from abroad. That's where the trade deficit is. But tariffs can't lower spending or raise production in a full employment economy. Therefore, tariffs will not close the deficit. Maybe if they cause a recession, that might reduce the spending for a while, but that'll be temporary. Second, tariffs cannot reindustrialize the US. Reindustrializing the US, and the US deindustrialization has mimicked what's happened in most G7 countries, that requires coordinated long-term investments, like 5-10-year horizons at least. It requires trained workers who are capable of working in the economies, the factories of the 21st century. It requires world-class infrastructure. And tariffs achieve none of these goals, just the opposite, especially the volatile tariffs, make people hesitate and not want to invest, and it certainly doesn't want to make workers engage in long-term training for jobs that might not be there when it goes up and down. Lastly, the tariffs can't help the US middle class. A simple fact is that tariffs protect goods-producing sectors, for instance, steel. But only about 90% of the middle class, only about 10% of the middle class works in goods-producing sectors. 90% of the middle class works in service sectors where tariffs only raise the cost of living. So the idea that it's going to help the middle class is exactly the opposite. So what we see is tariffs are a substitute for real solutions and a way of deflecting blame from policy failures inside Washington. So the real economic solutions are politically impossible. Policies like Canadian-style social policies would help the US middle class, as they have done in every other advanced economy. And here I'm talking universal health care, free university, excellent schools, active labor market policies that help people adjust to the shocks. But this would require higher taxes and bigger governments, so it's politically impossible in today's America. And the budget bill that we're seeing right now is absolute testimony that raising taxes is a million miles away from the political consensus. Now, given this, tariffs and anti-globalism more generally are policy placebos given in lieu of effective medicine. So Democrats and Republicans have used the placebo to divert blame for domestic failure. Both traditional Democrats and traditional Republicans now all buy into some version of the grievance doctrine. Under Biden, for example, they called it worker-centric trade policy, this idea that somehow or another the trade policy had hurt America working class. So let me just finish with that point, is you cannot imagine a US presidential candidate saying, let's go back to the world of George Bush Jr. or even Clinton, when trade was a good thing in America. The US was supporting the world trading system. It was signing trade agreements. You can't imagine people going back. Maybe it won't be quite as hostile as Trump, but for example, Biden didn't take those tariffs off. So let me make that point a little clearer. So the US trade hesitancy or hostility is not new. The US switched from super pro-trade to trade hesitant after the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. So between 81 and 83, we had Reagan to Bush Sr. The US was super pro-trade. I was in the White House during the last parts of that. And it was, people really liked trade, really liked the rules, and there was an enormous respect for supporting the system. It was part of the American leadership of the world. From 94 to 2008, we had Clinton to Bush Jr. was also super pro-trade. That's when the WTO was created. That's when China acceded to the WTO. That's when NAFTA was created. Obama won, which started just with the global financial crisis, switched to trade hesitancy. So Obama put on ice all the trade negotiations that Bush Jr. had started but hadn't finished. Moreover, Obama was the first one to block the appointment of an appellate body judge to the WTO and therefore started the undermining of the WTO system. Now, Obama was not anti-trade. Obama, deep down, was a globalist, but he could not politically be pro-trade because of the suffering of the middle class, which everybody was blaming on globalization. And then Trump was elected and trade hesitancy turned to trade hostility. Then Biden was elected, it went back to trade hesitancy, but Biden did not remove the tariffs that Trump had put on, except in a few cases where he put on quotas instead of the tariffs. Moreover, Biden intensified the war against Chinese advanced manufacturing, and so in some sense kept up this narrative that the foreigners are to blame. Then, of course, Trump comes in and trade hostility is unbound. So my point here is that since 2009, the US has not really been pro-trade, and I don't see it going back. So get used to it. The US is no longer pro-trade, and it will protectionist and continue that way, in my view. So the US is on a protectionist loop. The middle class is suffering. That's for real. And the middle class demands action. The social policy that would actually help them is politically impossible because that would require higher taxes. So instead, they use anti-globalism. That anti-globalism, the protection fails to fix the middle class malaise, so the loop keeps going. And the US is locked into this protectionism for the foreseeable future, as anti-globalism is a policy placebo, persists politically because it's ineffective economically. And this is not a Democrat or Republican thing. It's here to stay. Fifth point, how the world moves on. So the first thing to say is that the world trading system so far is okay. The April 2nd tariffs and rule-based system, the system is wounded, but it survives. So the April 2nd tariffs were US violations of non-discrimination, MFN, and promise-keeping, the tariff bindings. And the US is the largest importer of goods, but it hasn't been dominant for over 25 years. This is showing from 2000 to 2023, the share of US imports is down around 11%. Let's just say 15%, depending upon how you measure it. So the US is only 15% of the world trade. So the rules have been broken only with 15% of world trade. The other 85% is okay for now. And that's the great hope, is that it will stay okay. So now I want to talk about the ripple effects of the April 2nd hack. So the US is an important market, and the tariffs were so large that it led other countries, third countries, to change their trade policy. And that's what I call ripple effects. So third nation tariffs are rising and falling since April 2nd, and even since Trump first administration, since it was clear that the US was moving towards protectionism even back in 2018. So third countries are raising tariffs against each other, especially against China. For example, tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The US put up their tariffs to 100%. Those vehicles were diverted to Canada. Canada put up their tariff to 100%. Those vehicles were feared to be diverted to Europe, so Europe put up their tariffs. So this is what I could call cascading protectionism. When the US protects, it creates trade diversion, which leads to new protectionist pressures, which can lead to new tariffs. Moreover, but on the other side, countries are striking or accelerating trade deals without the US. So since April 2nd, the UK-India trade agreement, which was long and slow, suddenly got signed. The UK's accession to CPT went through finally, and China and Brazil signed agreements, all this in the last couple months. So this idea that domino liberalization, exporters who used to export to the US want to open up other markets, they push their governments into liberalizing, that's the opposite effect. So we have two things going on here. Things that lead to higher protection in third countries and things that lead to lower protection in third countries. And when I talk through the scenarios, I'm going to talk through the balance of those things. Here are the four scenarios. So the first one on the left is the 1930s scenario. It's unlikely, I believe, but what we have to really fear is that other nations ignore WTO rules and allow grievance to guide their policies. Because many countries, including China, have grievances about the world. Japan has grievances, the European Union has grievances, and many countries around the world have grievances against the United States, against Europe, against Japan, against China. So all these things, if their leaders follow Trump, could lead to a system-wide collapse. So the possible triggers are, first of all, the cascading protection that I talked about, if it doesn't follow WTO rules. So for example, if the new protection is anti-dumping duties that follow the WTO rules, the system can survive because those rules put guardrails on the retaliation. China, the second one is China retaliates against anti-China provisions. So China has said that if countries agree in deals with the US to things that are against China, then China may retaliate against those partners of the US. Now that is starting to lead to big tariffs outside the US market. And since China is a very large part of that 85%, that could start the whole system unwinding. So I think that's something very important to worry against. The other three are less radical. So the one that's actually underway is what I call managed multilateral drift. So we get some more protection and some more liberalization, but the US is the only one who violates WTO rules on purpose. At least everybody else pretends that they're following WTO rules. Second is we get fighting trade blocs. For instance, if the US, the EU, and China form trade blocs, and then they start putting tariffs up against each other. That would be bad. And again, it's countries disrespecting the WTO rules because it would be systematically raising tariffs that were bound. The third is reglobalization without America. Now, in this world, America has its big tariffs and countries retaliate against the US or not, but the US ends up exporting less, importing less. It becomes more closed, but the whole rest of the world goes back to the trading system where trade is a good thing. Trade is the infrastructure of prosperity. So the sixth point of what they must do, and here I have just a few minutes left. I'm going to be relatively quick about this. Sorry to the interpreters, I've been talking too fast, but so this is the sixth point, what world leaders must do to step up now. So what to do? The prime directive, to use a Star Trek analogy, is save the rules-based system by following the rules. So if the 80 countries who count for the 85% of trade that does not involve the US simply follow the rules, then the system will survive because rule following in 85% of the world trade is good enough. Things not to do is don't retaliate against the US except China and the EU. That's because only China and the EU are big enough to withstand the kind of bullying that the US has shown it will do when countries try and stand up. Both China and the EU are relatively closed. Their economies would work relatively well even if there was a severe disruption with the US. Not perfectly, there'd be problems, but it's not a threat to their national prosperity. The other countries, including Japan, should negotiate using the grievance doctrine as the compass. When you're thinking about what kind of concessions to give to President Trump and how that should be spun, realize that he's not pursuing economic goals that are carefully laid out and analyzed by economic analysis. So he has some idea that trade deficits are bad. So if you agree to buy more commodities or more arms, that's a win as far as he's concerned. But he does not have a spreadsheet by how much you have to do to give him the win. The main thing is how it looks. So the second point is do nothing radical until we see where the April tariffs land. And this is on July 9th, we should have clarifications, although given the flip-flopping that's going on, that may be delayed. So the last point is keep the door open to US re-entry. Don't do anything that burns bridges with the US, make your deals, retaliate if you have to or not, but stay diplomatic with the US because the trade system would be better if the US comes back in. And although I'm predicting that it won't, the future is unknowable. The last thing to do is if the trade deficit continues to be a very large problem for the US administration and the tariffs don't fix it, which they can't, they may switch to a macro side of this. It's called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, and it was laid out by a memo written by the current chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Stefan Miran. And also, there's a provision in the budget bill called Section 899, which allows Trump to put up taxes on foreign investors in the US if the US decides that the US companies are being treated unfairly on tax basis. So in essence, this Section 899 is a whole new arsenal of tools that Trump can use to bully other countries. And it involves taxes, not tariffs, and potentially involves taxes on things like coupons on treasury bills. So it could be extremely disruptive to the world financial system. And I think all countries and all companies should prepare a playbook of what would happen if they actually go down that route. Okay, so I'm going to skip the whole thing on leadership. Well, no, maybe I'll do it quickly. What I call leadership herds. So if you believe that the US has stepped down from trade leadership, then the question is, who leads the world trading system after the US? And I would argue that the EU can't, China can't, Japan can't, and the EU can't, and no other countries are even vaguely large enough to make it make sense. But that's okay, because in fact, we've already seen what leadership looks like in the WTO when the US is not leading. So for example, Japan, when the US left TPP, organized loosely a herd of countries to save TPP, and it turned into CPTPP without the US. Now, there was no formal titles. Japan wasn't the chairman of some committee. There was no G group following it. It was just a bunch of countries who had similar interests, who cooperated together to do leadership, which was to take the CPTPP forward. The same thing happened when the US killed the WTO court, the appellate body. The EU loosely organized a herd of countries, which included China, to save it with a temporary agreement called the multilateral multi-party interim agreement for appealing WTO cases. And again, there was no title, no chairmanship, no structure, no committees. They just worked together with a bunch of coalition of like-minded countries to lead the system forward after the US had stepped away. So that's what I think is going to happen going forward. Herds without the US could move the WTO forward to address 21st century challenges like trade rules, climate change, digitalization problems, cyber attacks. The trade rules of the WTO haven't been updated since 1994, and a lot of things have happened, so these leadership herds might actually be a silver lining. So that would also help smooth system clashes between China's state-led capitalism and market-led capitalism in the advanced economies. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion. I'm going to stop right there, and I'll stop sharing my slides.